Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 14 of Compliance Into the Weeds, a podcast with Matt Kelly and Tom Fox. In this podcast, we take one topic of note in the greater compliance world and go into the weeds to discuss it. Today, we begin what will be no doubt a lengthy exploration of the Wells Fargo ongoing scandal. Matt wrote a blog post which he looked at the fraud triangle and then put it up against the conduct at Wells Fargo. I've written several blog posts this week where I talk about the risk of selling and how that can move from a benign risk to a much more highly grievous risk, indeed $185 million fine risk. The tones at the top of the various leaders and their tones at Wells Fargo, and the internal controls, the research and training that Wells did, and how all of that failed them. This episode comes in at just around 20 minutes, and I hope you enjoy it. This is Tom Fox. I'd like to thank you very much for listening to this episode of Compliance Into the Weeds. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and I'd like to welcome you back to Compliance Into the Weeds, a podcast with Matt Kelly and Tom Fox. And today we have a delicious episode for you, which will probably be the first of many. But we're going to start on Wells Fargo, as Matt has written a very interesting article called Fitting the Fraud Triangle to Wells. So, Matt, with that, welcome. And I think we both have a lot to write, think, and say about this case.
Hi, Tom. Yeah, it's great to be back here. And good Lord, after our other podcasts where we kept on thinking this, whatever that we might have talked about early in the year, this must be the big mess of the year for 2016. Along comes Wells Fargo and kind of bigfooted every other corporate compliance blunder we've seen lately, because this one takes the cake.
You know, it really does, Matt, and I've spent a lot of time studying this over the weekend. I'm in the middle of a 5 blog post series on it, but you came at it with a really interesting angle. Of course, I've been previously exposed to the fraud triangle, but I was recalled or reminded about it by Kelly Pope's talk at the TEC conference in San Diego we both attended. So I was really intrigued by you applying it to Wells Fargo. So for people who don't know, Wells Fargo recently was fined $185 million by a variety of regulators for basically cross-selling products to customers that they either didn't want or didn't need. These products were credit cards, debit cards, fraudulent loans, some $2 million in products and services that were attributed to customers who either didn't want them or didn't need them. And Wells Fargo fired over 5,300 people over this. There are going to be congressional hearings, possibly criminal investigations. All of those we can go into later, but with that somewhat long-winded or quick introduction, I should say, Matt, how did you apply what we know so far in this case to the fraud triangle? Maybe you should even start by what is the fraud triangle and then apply it.
Sure. The fraud triangle is a very common idea and metaphor in the audit world. So if anybody listening is not from the audit world, we can run it through very quickly. But the fraud triangle are the 3 basic pressures that would lead someone to commit fraud against an organization. And they are rationalization, pressure, and opportunity. So do they have some sort of real need to commit fraud? Can they actually do it? Is there a method or opportunity for them to commit the fraud, whatever it might be? And how do they rationalize that it's okay for me to commit a crime? And people talk about the fraud triangle all the time. You mentioned Kelly Pope, who has done some great research on what motivates people to commit fraud. And I think it is a valuable tool just generally to try and get at how might someone commit misconduct at my company? Usually people would think of fraud and they're thinking, it's somebody in the procurement department who's embezzling, or someone in accounting who's forging invoices to chisel away a little bit of money every year for 20 years. And that happens. But, we can get into this. I just realized there's no reason why you couldn't use those same basic concepts, the same tool of the triangle, in many other misconduct kind of ways, which I think if we do that with Wells, it gets us into all sorts of interesting ideas.
So one of the things you did, which I found intriguing, was you looked at the fraud triangle from a triangle of different length sides, if I've said that correctly, because typically we see a fully equal sided, three-sided triangle, but you have explored fitting the triangle to the company, and then you fit it to what you knew about Wells Fargo when you wrote the article. So could you explain why you saw this flaw in an equalized fraud triangle and how it might fit the triangle to your own company or to someone's company?
Sure. And in fact, anybody listening, if you actually do an image search of the fraud triangle, you'll see exactly what Tom and I are talking about here, that a three-sided equal triangle, I believe the technical geometry term is an equilateral triangle. My 10th grade geometry teacher would be proud that I know that. In fact, I had to go and confirm it and look it up. But an equilateral triangle of three equal sides is what people typically see when you look at the fraud triangle. And it occurred to me as I was thinking about Wells Fargo first, aside from the conduct and the misconduct that went on there, which we could get into, the opportunity part was enormous because this went on for years and it went on all over the country. And it's not as if these new products just were created and then vanished momentarily. They existed on customer accounts for quite a while sometimes. And so where were the controls that would detect this is an unused account? There's a whole bunch of dormant accounts in this branch. Why was the audit not catching it? And I realized that, okay, so this is an opportunity failure that was enormous, and then it hit me. And I think this is where the fraud triangle can really get to be useful. The sides of the triangle don't have to be equal. And here in the real world, they typically are not equal. You might have enormous pressure personally to go and commit fraud, in which case that leg of the triangle would be gigantic. And you would then find a way to do it if you really needed it. If your spouse is dying of cancer, if your child is about to become homeless, that's the sort of justification people have. If you have that sort of huge pressure, even if the opportunity is small, you're going to find the opportunity. And suddenly I realized the triangle itself, that can be any number of lengths. I think when they're two equal lengths, they're isosceles. When they're three different lengths, don't ask me. I'm sorry, 10th grade teacher from high school. I don't remember what that is. But you can use the fraud triangle, bend it in any number of sizes and shapes that fit your particular risks. That's the point here.
The other thing that struck me when I read this article you wrote, Matt, was tying it into a prior article, because the fraud triangle, if we apply it to Wells Fargo, would look very different if we applied it to the corporate office vis-a-vis the branches, which are the operational units of the bank. So the rationalization leg might be quite longer at the corporate office, or perhaps even the opportunity, where the pressure leg might be the longest leg at the operational unit or the branch. And from my research, or at least the newspaper articles I read, what I saw was huge pressure to cross-sell these products at the branch level.
And I think that is a very important point that compliance officers who might be worried, does my own company, do we have a Wells problem? That's something that you need to think about and ask all the time. What is the risk of misconduct I'm worried about? How would those three fraud triangle forces fit? Would they fit? And it's an excellent point you raised. Would the triangle look the same at the local level as it would at the corporate level? Would it look the same in the U.S. versus emerging markets? I mean, we're talking about Wells, but it could be used for any number of companies and any number of troubles that were misconduct. But you have to keep on thinking, what is the proportionality of these three risks? And what would the triangle look like? That's really what a compliance officer wants to get at, and how you want to sort of train your thinking. Because here in the real world, rationalization, pressure, and opportunity, they never arrive in three equal doses that therefore lead you to commit fraud. The triangle might change over time. It might expand, it might shrink, different legs move at different speeds, all sorts of things like that. But you need to keep on thinking about what would the triangle look like for the risk I think I have.
Matt, you also wrote about what you call the anti-fraud triangle, or as we would say in Texas, that anti-fraud triangle, where you matched up the counterparts from a best practice or effective ethics and compliance program to each one of the legs of the fraud triangle. And first of all, could you explain the anti-fraud triangle? But second of all, the thing that intrigued me was, as with the different shaped or different length legs of the fraud triangle, you could also have different length legs in the anti-fraud triangle to bring a solution. So why don't you describe that for us?
Yeah, I think that once you run through, I'll call it the fraud triangle exercise, and you have a good sense of what shape your particular triangle might look like and its size, you then have to think about, how do I solve these problems? And really, all three of the fraud triangle forces, rationalization, pressure, opportunity, they have a counterpart in the ethics and compliance program. The opportunity to commit fraud is solved by having controls. Maybe they're policies, maybe they're IT security measures, maybe there's segregation of duties. But that's one. The rationalization that it's okay for me to commit a felony. It's okay for me to steal from my co-workers and my boss or whatnot. That gets to values, are the antidote for that. And then the pressure that I really need to do this no matter what. And there probably are fraudsters who don't like that they're committing fraud, but they feel like I have to. I'm under pressure. The antidote to that, I would argue, at least one of them, is having the proper culture. I would say specifically to Wells Fargo, I think this is one big failure of theirs, that it seems like there was relentless pressure to meet sales goals, which is why employees engaged in these practices. The problem there was the culture was too high stress and focused on meet your quotas or you will get counseled out or fired or whatever. That's a culture problem. That's a lousy culture. But once you have your fraud triangle drawn, you think, well, you need to inject the anti-fraud components I just mentioned in proportionate doses. If you've got a tremendous opportunity, you need very strong controls. If you've got relentless pressure, you might want to change that. That means setting a different culture. Rationalization that it's okay for me to do this, that's just lack of good values and telling people what the company's about. And, you need to make sure that all of your counter forces are up to the task that you have drawn out what you think your threats are on the fraud triangle. That's my point. And I should add, for all of the triangles we're talking about here, anybody who's listening, I've got all sorts of triangle graphics now on my post about this on Radical Compliance. You can look them up and see what we mean.
And we're certainly going to link to that in the show notes. But with when a compliance officer looks at these, Matt, does the triangle work for either different locations, as we've talked about, corporate office versus the operational unit, but even for different products or services? So what I'm trying to get at is what may seem to be a rather benign product, such as a debit card or a credit card or even a loan application, when taken to an extreme or some other point, it becomes a criminal act. So does this fraud triangle have the flexibility, or does it give the compliance officer a flexibility to look at different situations and different scenarios?
I would say it could. I would say it probably depends on the flexibility of thinking between the compliance officer and probably other parties who would want to go through this exercise with you. Certainly, audit firms that are auditing your company would want to, you might want to sit down and talk with them about where you think these risks are. Anybody else involved in a fraud risk assessment. And I'm not saying you should create a matrix of fraud triangles. We have enough matrices in this particular branch of corporate life. But, the concept, the flexibility of mind, using this as a tool to figure out what's the relative amount of these fraud motives that I might be lurking around in my company. And they lurk in all different ways, and compliance officers have many different problems and risks. So, I think that as a basic exercise to kind of go through is probably very worthwhile.
Well, Matt, I think Wells Fargo, at least in my mind, is going to be one of the great teaching tools for the compliance officer going forward. Obviously, or at least at this point, we don't believe it has any touch points with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act because the fraud appears to be domestic only. Nevertheless, I find the entire scope of what we know so far, corporate governance, senior management, board of directors, internal controls, training, culture, values, incentives, all to be present in this case. So I am sure we'll be able to talk about this matter going forward. But is there anything that you have read or heard over the weekend or perhaps the last week that really struck you or stuck out to you as something that's going to take this case really above the fray?
I think the one thing that is going to really stand out, or I suppose stick out like a sore thumb with Wells Fargo, is will the company claw back the executive pay that very senior executives won based on these falsified sales goals? And this really gets to a very sticky, difficult corporate governance issue because under the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, under the Dodd-Frank Act, these companies do have the right to claw back pay, specifically if it leads to a material adverse impact on the financials or a restatement or something like that. Now, this is a big scandal, and it's a lot of money to the individuals who fell prey to it, but to the company overall, this is not a material thing. But it looks so bad, and the stain on the reputation that I am hard-pressed to see how the company would justify not clawing the compensation back. I don't even know exactly what the language of their clawbacks are. By law, they would be required, I believe, to claw it back if it led to a restatement or if it's material. It's not. Do they have any other flexibility that they could anyways under other circumstances that look bad, like people like you and me having podcasts and everybody else is going to gang up on them? This is one thing where, will the company do the right thing just because it likes doing the right thing? And if it doesn't, that's anybody with a second grade education is going to see that kind of stinks. And it's going to be tough for the bank to keep a straight face if that's its position. We don't know. We'll have to see.
Well, in terms of materiality, that's certainly a really interesting part of this case because although there were 2 million underlying transactions or fraudulent transactions, I think I saw that the amount of money generated was in the range of $10 to $15 million. We were talking about a $65 billion corporation, so clearly not material. We have a fine of $185 million. I've read of internal investigations cost at between $50 and $100 million. And here's the kicker. They lost $6 billion last week of stock value, moving from the number one highest grossing financial institution in the world to number two behind JP Morgan. So I think at some point it did become material, and they're going to have to address that issue at some point because of the loss of consumer confidence. And as you said, if they don't really get out in front of this entire scandal, why would you ever trust them going forward?
Yeah, it sets a very bad taste in people's mouths. It's an easy type of misconduct to grasp. This isn't arcane accounting fraud. I would not be surprised if the CEO leaves because of this. And when he does appear in Congress in the next couple of weeks, good Lord, that is really going to be a tough interview for him because this is just a huge, pervasive, extensive, long-lasting problem at Wells. And I don't know how you get out of that without making some really grand gesture like giving CEO and other executive pay back. So that's one. There's all sorts of other stuff you and I could get in on future podcasts, but that's the one that I think most of the public will really be able to see and to grasp, and is the clawback pay issue.
Well, Matt, as always, it's been a great pleasure. For those who are interested, Matt is speaking next week at Compliance Week. Matt, could you give a little preview of your talk?
Sure, yeah. It's the Society of Corporate Compliance and Ethics big annual conference. That I will be talking about enterprise risk management and how boards are trying to get a grasp of what they should do there and how to apply a really systemic approach to risk rather than what many boards, I think, typically do is a retrospective of did we have any blow-ups last quarter? Like you and I have been talking about, you can have a blow-up right in your quarter and you're still not prepared for it. How about getting a bit more forward thinking about how you spell out what risk management should look like at your company? So I did a little study of how often board charters mention risk, how often they mention it in an intelligent way, and some ideas about how compliance and risk officers could maybe help the board help you, which I think is a big problem for a lot of boards, to give guidance about what they want to make compliance and risk functions work a little bit better.
Well, Matt, I'm going to be speaking with Dun & Bradstreet Chief Compliance Officer Louis Saperman, who is accepting an award on behalf of Dun & Bradstreet for their innovative use of social media in their internal compliance program. So he and I are going to speak on what social media tools you can use internally in your compliance program. So if you're at the SCCE, I hope you will drop in at one or both of our sessions, and we look forward to seeing you. And Matt, I look forward to seeing you next week as well.
All right, Tom, take care.
Thanks a lot.